Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. We're your hosts, Nick Fenagoni
and Tanya Marco-Viello. Our Queer Spirit Podcast spotlights queer artists, healers, practitioners, activists, and beings
who share their work and magic with our LGBTQIA, two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming communities and the collective. Our guest today is Rae McDaniel, they, them. Rae is a non-binary speaker, author, therapist, certified sex therapist, coach, and transgender diversity and inclusion educator. Rae helps audiences gain the sheer audacity to be themselves in the world through play, pleasure, and possibility. Their book, Gender Magic, is a first-of-its-kind practical guide to achieving gender freedom with joy, curiosity, and pleasure for transgender and non-binary individuals, gender explorers, and those who love them. Rae is also the founder and CEO of Practical Audacity, a gender and sex therapy practice in Chicago serving over 300 clients annually.
During our shared time, Rae shares their story about growing up in a conservative, religious family of traveling puppeteers and how they eventually found community with the theater crowd in college. We talk about the evolution of gender and queer community and ponder what the future of gender looks like. Rae reads an excerpt from their new book, and we explore what it means to be in flow with the unfolding journey of gender.
Find them and their work at rae-mcdaniel.com. That's RAE-MCDANIEL.com.
All right, Grand Rising all. I'm Tanya Marco-Viello. My pronouns are they, them, and we are so honored. And this is Nick Fenagoni and Rae McDaniel, and we are so glad to be here this morning for Queer Spirit Podcast. We like to kick off our space with a grounding, so we're going to all ground in together this morning and get centered with our time. So the invite here is to maybe shift your position, wiggle your toes, fingers, connect to that natural inhale and exhale of the breath, bringing in those energies of anchoring, grounding, being present for our shared time today. If your body wants to support that anchoring in with a little stretch, a flex, a twist, a lean, the invite is to honor that. Maybe deepening the inhale through the nose, releasing through the mouth. Here on Queer Spirit Podcast, we like to honor our lands. And so this morning, I'd like to call in and honor the Tonga, Keech, and Chumash land. Nick, would you like to honor your land?
Yes, I'd like to honor the Ohlone and the Yalamu land.
And Rae, would you like to honor the land you're on?
Absolutely. I'd like to honor the land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations.
Right on. We also want to just honor our elements, earth, air, fire, water, and ether. One more inhale, bringing in that grounding energy, sharing it here amongst us on the exhale. Right on. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. That was beautiful.
So Rae, we're so excited to have you here and hear about all that you've been bringing to the queer community and your new book that you're just birthing into the world. And I always like to start out our conversations with folks to hear a little bit more about, their history and your queer story and what brought you to where you are today. And, if you want to share any of your coming out story as a queer being and that kind of thing to really connect us all in together.
Absolutely. So my X-Men origin story is a wild and winding ride. So taking us way back to the beginning, I was the adopted child of Southern Baptist, evangelical, traveling missionary puppeteers, which is a real sentence. And it was a very strange way to grow up. I went around the United States for most of my teenage life, performing about 4 nights a week, and then went to this tiny little evangelical college in East Texas. And that whole time, I knew something felt different in me and something wasn't connecting with the culture that I was surrounded with my parents. but I couldn't put my finger on it. I don't even think it was in the language that I was hearing. And I was so isolated in that environment that it wasn't even an option to consider myself as a queer person, to consider myself as a transgender person. And so I didn't. I just knew something was different. And so I got to undergrad and immediately was best friends with the theater kids on campus, which were some of the only out-ish gay kids in that environment. And in an environment where being out to the wrong person could potentially get you expelled. So it was very oppressive. I, along the way, also fell in love with psychology. So paired with my love of psychology, my budding friendships with this group of people that I saw really struggling with their queer identity, with relationships, with family, and with religion, the way I grew up no longer made sense to me at all. And so about halfway through college, I let that mostly go and started getting to know myself a little bit better. Still wasn't out as queer, but was very adjacent for quite a while. And decided that I wanted to work with the LGBTQ population doing therapy. So I went to grad school in Chicago, escaped the South is what it really felt like to me. And pretty much immediately when I got to Chicago, the closet doors were flung open and I just felt like I could breathe. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. And so I came out very quickly after that. And my friends in college, it was very anticlimactic. I came out to some of them and, it was a big deal for me. And they're like, oh, sorry, we thought you were already out. Like, okay, all right, y'all. So that happened, came out as queer to my family it probably took a couple years, to be honest, because I knew what I was going to be getting myself into when I came out as queer to my family. And I was very, very lucky and very privileged to already have a really strong queer community around me before I even came out. Not most, but a lot of my friends were queer. I was working at an LGBTQ practice. There was a ton of support around me, and I feel very, very lucky. And I don't know what I would have done without that support. But I knew that coming out to my family was going to be not fun. And I was right. It did not go well. And I'll spare you a lot of the details except this one, which really drives the point home, is my father threatened to get a restraining order against me for coming out to his family. And so that was rough. Again, I had a ton of support, but it was a bit rough. And at the same time, I was happier than I had ever been. I felt more comfortable in my own skin than I ever had. I was, in my 20s and it was messy and it was new, but it was also really beautiful. And then roughly like age 27, 28, 29, somewhere in there, I started having a little bubble about my gender identity as well. Right when I thought I had it all figured out, as it happens. For me, that felt very gentle. I was already working in my professional life with a lot of people who were exploring gender and in transition. It felt like a natural next step for me and something to explore. And there was never a light bulb moment. I describe in Gender Magic that it felt like I was wearing a shoe that was a size too small or half a size too small. And that I was fine for a while. For a lot of my life, my assigned gender as female was fine. And then it wasn't. And it started feeling like I was wearing a shoe that was causing me blisters. And it was to the point that it was taking up a lot of brain space. When you have a blister, you can't really walk without thinking about it. And you certainly can't run or dance or do things that really bring you a lot of joy. And that's how it felt. So when I allowed myself to expand in that way, it again felt like I could breathe and it felt like I was more myself than ever. And then to cut the story short at the end, I got on testosterone. I had top surgery. Both of those things really kicked off during the pandemic. So it was a time of a lot of personal growth for me, like so many people. But I will stop there.
Aw, I was just so enthralled. I'm like, more, Ray, I want more. Thank you so much. I really just want to appreciate how you named your discovery of community and chosen family, and how that actually, where you landed there before coming out, is so beautiful, so that you felt a different sense of being held through that process. And also for naming the tenderness of coming out to biological families, as it isn't easy for our queer selves to walk that path. And thank you for naming that. And as well as thank you for honoring your gender identity. I mean, that is such a huge part of our queerness and being able to honor our authentic selves. So thank you for that. I have a question regarding, like, if you could go back in time now as your adult self and you could share with 10-year-old Rae anything that you wanted to about coming out, being queer, gender identity, what would you share with them?
First of all, I would give them a huge hug.
Yeah.
Right. Give them a huge hug and say that I know how hard it is to, even 10-year-old me, like, I know how hard it is to be you and how alone you feel. And I would also say that, how would I put it? Let me think about that for a second. I think one of the first things I would say is that you're not broken. I grew up in this really oppressive religious environment. And as an adult, I reread some of those journals and realized how toxic it was, how much of those journals were just about me talking to a God that I then believed in and telling him how broken I was and how I wanted him to fix me. And I would go back and tell that 10-year-old kid that you are not broken and you do not need to be fixed. And that the greatest gift that you can give yourself and the world is to be the most authentic version of you. And no matter what it costs, it's worth it. Now, I don't know if my 10-year-old self will be able to take all that in, but I would have said it.
Right on. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Rae, I want to rewind a little bit to what you just said about how you said you just were kicking off, like having had your top surgery and taking hormones right during the beginning of the pandemic. And I wonder, like, what that was like for you, because I think about, I'm a therapist myself as well, and like how being in quarantine was for queer people. And for some queer people, it was really good because it felt safe, maybe because of the environment or the community that they lived in. And for other people, it felt really isolating. And so I wonder, like, what that might have been like for you, maybe to feel isolated as you were just beginning this shift in your identity, especially the way you presented physically, and maybe a little bit of both, like not having, friends and peers celebrating you and maybe other people not quite understanding what was going on. But I'm curious, like, what that was like for you.
It was really interesting. And I think it was both. And I had this experience, and I also heard this reflected back to me from clients and friends and different people I was talking to. And that, of course, the pandemic was horrible. And it did feel very isolating in a lot of ways. And there's this other side of it of, we suddenly didn't have to deal with going to the office. We suddenly, or a lot of us, at least the people I was talking to, suddenly didn't have to deal with going and taking public transit as a trans person. Didn't have to deal with all of this constant feedback we're getting about our appearance and how we're showing up in the world in the same way. And for a lot of people, and for me in some ways, that was very freeing. And I think a lot of people discovered a lot about who they are when everything gets a little quiet. And we don't often have that opportunity. The isolation piece, I'm an extrovert. I'm an introverted extrovert, but I am an extrovert. And so it was a little tough. Again, I'm very lucky that I live with two people here, so I wasn't completely isolated, and we eventually, potted up and were able to see each other. Got a dog too, so that helped with the isolation. But me starting testosterone and getting top surgery, neither one of those things were new in my brain, but some important decisions were made over the pandemic. I was on testosterone and I was out as trans and non-binary to pretty much everybody at that point. I was doing a gel testosterone before the pandemic and then started doing shots, which, if you know about the differences there is a lot quicker and a lot more drastic body changes that happen with shots than typically do with gels. And so suddenly my voice dropped 2 or 3 octaves and I wasn't talking to anybody as much. And so it was this really interesting thing of a good 6 to 9 months where every time I would talk to somebody on the phone or hop on Zoom who hadn't talked to me in a while, their first thing that they said was, "Oh my God, your voice." And it mostly wasn't negative, except my family, who maybe still to this day think that I have a really bad cold for years. I don't know. But it was interesting to hear people's responses, and even my loved ones they didn't quite know how to react. And so their voices would go up. They were kind of stumbling around a little bit, which is, the normal thing to do when something changes, but I could tell. And so there is an amount of time where I got tired of hearing people say things about my voice, at the same time, really deeply digging what my voice sounded like, and did some work with a speech therapist. I speak it's part of what I do for a living. So it was important to me to find a way to express my voice in a way that felt truly authentic and also supported by my breath and my habits. So I worked with a speech therapist. And so a lot changed about how I communicated and what I sounded like. And after that initial 6 to 9 months, it was fine. And I started getting compliments that are, the compliment I wanted from the very beginning, which is that, "Oh, you have a radio voice." Yes, I have arrived. Great. And then the top surgery was an interesting journey for me. So it was very much a tip of the iceberg kind of deal. Is when I made the decision and made it public, it shocked a lot of people, because even the people who were closest to me, a lot of them didn't know that I had been thinking about this for 3 or 4 years and not struggling with it, which I think is an important note here. Is I wasn't struggling. It wasn't keeping me up at night. It was just in the back of my head, and I was chewing on it and thinking about it when it came up with some ease, which felt like a really nice vibe to make that decision from. And realized over the pandemic that the only reason I hadn't gotten top surgery was because I had always had breast. And that was no longer a good enough reason. I didn't have very intense body dysphoria, and I'm, again, very lucky for that. But I got stuck in this loop of, you don't hate your body enough to change it, which is so wild that we often hear that narrative, is that you have to hate your body in order to change it, to feel more authentic. And so I made the decision and happened to find a doctor, I don't know how this happened, who is a great surgeon, but not well known in the trans world. And so I got in 2 months and would have gotten in earlier, except he offered a date a month out. And I'm like, I don't think I'm ready for that. So ended up making the decision. And then 2 months later, I had top surgery and have never looked back. I really feel better in my body than I ever have.
Right on. I really appreciate you naming how you honored the liberation of stillness and pausing in the time of the pandemic as a moment, an opportunity for you to delve a little deeper into honoring your authentic self. And for that was about that transformation that you went through physically, mentally, spiritually. And I think it's really beautiful that, you were able to be held in a capacity that way. And I'm curious, being an elder myself, like, and a lot of this transformation happening in a very different way in the times that we're living in. What kind of wisdom or queer nuggets would you drop to our queer elders that may be exploring, questioning, trying to find ways to honor their gender expansiveness or identities?
That's such a juicy question. I really love that.
Mm.
One of the first things I'll say is that there's often this huge question of, am I trans or am I non-binary? And I think that's the wrong question. It's useful in a lot of ways, and it's so big, or it can feel so big that question feels overwhelming. So if someone is exploring gender, whether that is exploring their gender identity, or if they are exploring a way that they might want to shift how they exist in the world, or what their body looks like, the questions that I find to be more helpful are, what is the next tiniest step that I can take towards my authentic self? Which is also a big question, but it's a little bit more of a manageable one. Because instead of this huge question of, am I trans? Am I non-binary? Do I want this, for, in my case, this surgery? It became, what would inch me closer to feeling more free in my body? What would inch me closer to feeling a bit more liberated? And I love that you brought in that stillness piece, because that is often where we get that answer. It's not going to be from Reddit or YouTube. There are many, many great educational things on there. That answer is going to come from you. And I focus so much on pleasure in my work, partly because pleasure connects us. And, listeners can't see this, but I'm pointing to my gut right now. Pleasure connects us to our gut. It connects us to our yes. And when we are able to identify what are the small ways that I experience pleasure in the world, and how I name my gender, how I express it, and even outside of that, and little daily life things, the more we are able to tune into that question of, what would make me feel the most free right now? Because the answer to that is that yes in your gut. So that's a huge one. I think another one is that discomfort isn't harm. And there's two sides of that coin. There's the side of the coin that you expanding your gender in whatever way that means to you, or, expanding your sexuality, just expanding who you are authentically in the world, that is going to cause other people to be uncomfortable, because you're changing, you're shaking up the status quo, you're shaking up family systems or friend systems or work systems. And that can bring some discomfort for people, but you are not harming them. You are not harming them by being yourself and expanding who you are, but it is harming you to not be able to express who you are, to hide parts of yourself. That is harming you. The other side of that coin is that discomfort isn't harm for you, because that growing and changing is again going to shake things up, and it's going to shake things up internally. So when you can get comfortable with, I'm going to do things that make me slightly uncomfortable, maybe not so uncomfortable that I'm flooded, but just the right amount of discomfort is, I think, essential in really finding who we are and living it out in the world.
Yeah.
Right on. I'm digging that. The yes, following the yes on in that gut, right? And honoring of authentic self, taking it low and slow, little bits at a time, versus looking at it as like, ta-da, you got to do this whole thing at once. Yeah, that's just so potent. Great medicine to drop there. What about our generations to come? What might you share with our generations to come and our young queer people? What queer nuggets of wisdom does Rae hold this morning?
I love these questions. For the younger folks who are listening, I cannot imagine what it is like to be in the place that we are right now, politically and legislatively and culturally, and having that be maybe the majority of your experience as a queer person or as a trans person or someone exploring gender. That feels heavy to me. At the same time, we are seeing more cultural attention and positive media attention for trans folks. That's phenomenal. The thing that I would want to tell the younger folks would be to stay connected to that joy and that pleasure and that connection and what we are moving towards. It's very easy, I think, to orient our activism, to orient ourselves towards everything that we are fighting against. And those things are important. And it's important for us to be fighting against the powers that want to oppress us. And I think we have to stay connected to why we are doing that, which is so that we can thrive. And not only we can thrive in some future world, but how do we create microcosms of thriving now? How do we connect to ourselves? How do we connect to each other? How do we bring more pleasure and joy and play into our lives right now, even while also holding all of the heavy stuff? Because those are the things that are really going to keep us going when the going gets tough.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think it's important to hold these visions for the future of gender. And Tanya Mark, I want to thank you for bringing in the ideas around queer elders. And I think it's important to think about, like, what does the future of gender look like for queer elders, not just for youth? I don't know if I have a question, but just more of a share, with some queer elders that I've been in community with over the last few years, especially, cis gay men who have survived the AIDS epidemic. A lot of them are really starting to explore what their gender is now, right? And I don't think it's not so much that they weren't authentic when they were younger, but I think there's a way to really look at how gender can evolve throughout a single person's lifetime, that it's not static. And I think that's one of the great things about, like, where we are now. We kind of went from, like, being out as a cis gay or lesbian person, and then sort of transgender, which is like still a binary in a way for a lot of people. And now we're in this place of fluidity, but also really looking at how does it change over a single person's lifetime, and is that okay, right? Which I believe it is okay. And, I wonder if part of it is around, like, the way that culture is starting to evolve, and also the way that just one's own chemistry and their hormones can shift and change over time, and how they want to change how they present themselves and just what feels more comfortable.
I love that you brought this up, Nick. And one of the things in Gender Magic that I talk a lot about is positioning gender exploration and transition as just another part of self-growth. And that speaks to the authenticity that you're talking about, because we've never arrived at our authentic self. I personally feel like I am the most authentic I have ever been, but, God help me if this is all it is, right? I want to continue to grow and change into more of who I am as I get older. That is a really natural part of our development and our growth as human beings. And if we think of gender as the same thing, it gives us so much freedom for that to potentially shift and change over our lifetime, or for how we express our gender to shift and change over our lifetime. And that is such a beautiful thing. And it doesn't mean that you weren't authentic in previous versions of yourself. You've just grown, right? And that's a beautiful thing. I've kind of lost track of the question, but I will say that I have worked with a lot of elders who have started exploring and transitioning their gender in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s, and have a bit more of a cultural permission to do so and more language around it. And I think that is such a beautiful thing. And I value intergenerational spaces and intergenerational relationships so much. I have several friends who are in their 50s or like inching into their 60s. And I value those relationships so much. And I think that there is so much we can learn from each other about all the things, but also about what was it like to live through the AIDS epidemic? What was it like to be a gay man in this time? And how can we all expand our understanding of ourselves together?
Yeah. It really makes me also want to name the fact that I think, here we are in 2023 where, folks, our elders grew up in a different set and setting. What tools and community and language that they had available, that kind of stuff wasn't available. It was very underground. There were a lot of, and speaking from my own toolkit, a lot of tools that I put into place to endure and survive rather than, actually live my authentic self. So I also want to acknowledge that the tools that came into play for our elder queers because of how they grew up or where they grew up or what was around or what wasn't around also, I believe, had a great effect. And at the same time, it lights me up that we have these gender expansive folks in a variety of ages that are saying, this is me, this is how I live. And I think it's so inspirational on a spectrum of levels for folks to be able to see like, hey, there are people that are out here in the world living their authentic life as they choose to be, whether it's pronouns, gender expression, gender identity, all of the things. And it's really important to see that. I think that is very inspirational and has such a healing frequency, because I do notice that maybe, with these trailblazers of folks that are saying, this is me and this is who I've always been. It also is very inspirational for an elder person to go, oh shit, like, hey, I could do this. This is something maybe I have held in my body or system for a long time. And now there's others that are doing that. So I feel like it's inspirational in that aspect. It's inspirational for our generations to come because they actually get to see modeled through other people living their authentic selves. And I just think it's such a potent medicine, for the entire spectrum of what we're looking at when it comes to identity, queerness, gender expression, all of the beautiful aspects that we get to explore when we're learning to live our authentic selves. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. I love that.
So shifting gears a little, Rae, you have a book that has just come out called Gender Magic, and I wonder if you would like to read a little from it for us.
Yes, I would love to do this. And listeners, I was telling Nick and Tanya Mark before we got on that it is such a treat to be able to actually start sharing this book that I've been working on for 2.5 years at this point, and I'm so honored to be reading bits of it for you. So I'm going to read a bit from the chapter on finding your magic, and it's talking about success and what does success, or in quotations, what does success mean for us as people who are exploring gender, as trans folks, as non-binary folks. So here we go. Emphasizing process and play instead of the outcome is very different from how we typically think of success in gender transition. When I ask my clients what successful transition would look like to them, many are laser focused on passing, or a preferred term, blending. I like this term because it reflects what I find my clients want the most: to exist without their transgender identity defining them. They want to stand at a bus stop and not be stared at, or walk down the street and not be afraid of violence. Sometimes there are real safety concerns related to one's desire to blend, and that's valid. Likewise, microaggressions like being misgendered, stared at, or not called by your correct name hurt. It can feel like death by 1,000 cuts, and I'm not here to minimize how painful it can be. And yet, gender exploration and transition are about you. Strangers on the street or the grocery store clerk should not get to define your self-worth or your gender's validity. And if your main criteria for successful gender transition is blending 100% of the time, you're giving away your power to people you can't control. This is where we get to change our definition of success. Successful gender transition is active gender exploration, consistent, intentional action to find the magic of having your actions, your beliefs, and how you show up in the world match up joyfully. It's the journey, not the outcome. When our measure of success becomes our own internal happiness, a continued effort to grow and change into more of who we are over our lifetime, the pressure's off. There's no handbook, no rules to follow, so it's impossible to do gender exploration wrong. As long as you're doing it right.
Beautiful. Thank you. It's so interesting that you read that based on what we were just talking about how we can explore our gender and how it can shift over a lifetime, that's what you chose to read. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for allowing me to read it.
Yeah.
We're so excited about what you shared. So that's what it is. We're eager we're like, I want to ask.
I was just going to say, I really like this idea of blending, and, maybe it's just like the queer person in me. I think about like makeup and blending and like, this like a gradient, right? And I totally get that. It's like, it's not just passing. I think there's a way in which passing also has this kind of like binary kind of thing. Like I'm either passing or I'm not passing, whereas blending in is a little bit more of a like, moving into and moving out of and that kind of thing. And there's this flow and fluidity to it. So yeah, I really like that idea.
That's a beautiful image. I had never thought about it from the makeup perspective, but that adds such another layer that I love.
Yeah, Rae, you've mentioned it a couple of times, and I know that, well, actually a few times in our shared time today about pleasure, joy, and play. And I really appreciate you bringing that to the forefront of all of this, that it's so important to, while honoring whatever our coming out or expression may be, that we also set aside that time for pleasure, joy, and play, because we're living our authentic lives. Let's be in celebration of that. And I'm curious about, what does your pleasure, joy, and play look like today for you?
So good. I love going dancing. So that, and specifically, I love going to queer parties where you're kind of packed in like sardines. It's the best. So that is a big place that I experience a lot of just raw joy. And that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. The little bit of quieter parts. So while I was writing the book, my schedule was a bit bananas because I was still working my quote unquote day job. And so I would get up at, 6:30 in the morning and write until I started work at 9 o'clock, and then usually would write at night as well for a lot of the days. And so when I finished writing, I reclaimed that time in the morning before 9 a.m. or at least before 8:30 to be my time. And I've now made it into a personal, quote unquote, rule for myself that my first cup of coffee is mine. And so I typically drink it on my couch with my dog on my shoulder because she's tiny, and read a fiction book. I've been very into sci-fi lately and speculative fiction. So giving myself space and the joy of sitting with my cup of coffee quietly in the morning. I'll like light some incense and with my fake fireplace with my dog and read this sci-fi book. And it's been so recharging and wonderful. I think the other thing is just creating more space to connect with my chosen family and my friends. That is something that keeps me going. It's something that fills my soul, and I get so much joy and pleasure from doing those things. And then anytime I have a chance to be out in nature is a beautiful thing as well. So I try to get out camping at least once or twice a season, or during the, camping season. And that is always so recharging and connecting to me personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, we really like to explore and hear the way all queer people are practicing self-care. And it's interesting, as you were talking about all those different things, you were talking earlier about like your introverted side and your extroverted side. And when you're like, I like to be in a packed dance floor, I'm like, oh, you're definitely an extrovert.
Definitely.
So I don't know if I can't speak for Tanya Mark about this, but I think that we're both more on the introverted side, and that the idea of that is like, I don't know about that.
That's not the thing that's going to fill your cup.
Yeah. So you may have already named it and all these different practices, but I always like to give people a chance to share a person, practice, or experience that has really supported your queerness or enhances or expands your queer spirit in the world.
I absolutely love this question. And I've been chewing on the answer to it since you told me that you'd ask it. And there's a few things. Some of them I have already named, like my community. I could not be where I am today without my chosen family and without the support that I had around me. So if there is one thing that I could give people, it would be find your people and really dig into them, because that has been fundamentally life-changing for me. On the more spirit side of things, or I guess, and here's another thing, I have over the pandemic gotten a lot more connected to ideas about interconnectedness in nature. And specifically, I read and then probably reread The Over Story, which is a beautiful book. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner about, it's an ecological fiction book, but in it is some of the most beautiful descriptions of nature and trees and interconnectedness and how they communicate that I've ever read. And I think it changed the way that I view myself in relation to nature. And so the idea as well about mycelium and how mycelium quite literally is the stuff that connects the entire earth, and that we are connected to that and we will return to it, has felt a very grounding thing for me. And then mycelium as a metaphor as well to our vast interconnectedness, even when we are not physically close to somebody, and how we can all support each other and communicate across long distances, but still hold each other up, has been a metaphor that has really informed a lot about how I view my chosen family and my community.
Yeah, yeah. I read that book also. It's really beautiful.
Oh, it's stunning.
So, Rae, before we let you go, can you share with our listeners how they can find you and your book and connect with you?
Sure. So you can get Gender Magic everywhere that books are sold. It should be in your libraries. If it's not, ask them for it. And you can connect with me. My hub is Instagram, so you can connect with me at the Rae McDaniel. That's Rae, R-A-E. If you go to the link in my bio, you can also purchase the book from there. And I would love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it was lovely to spend time with you today. And for our listeners, go grab Gender Magic, do yourself a favor and jump on that journey with Rae, because it sounds lovely. We want to close here with just a couple of breaths, and we'd like to invite both of you to, all of us here, all three of us, to close. So just taking a moment, connecting back to that breath, sending some gratitude through the inhale and exhale to our bodies and systems, the earth, air, fire, water, ether, all of the native lands and people of those lands, our transcestors, our queer ancestors. A nice deep inhale of gratitude through the nose, sharing that gratitude on the exhale. Thank you both.
Thank you so much for having me.
Resources that we shared today can be found in our show notes and at thequeerspirit.com.
You're invited to follow our show on Apple Podcasts or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, much love and blessings. Aho.